AFP of education. In my role with AFP, I help lead the education committee. We're a group of volunteers made up of fundraising professionals just like you, who help design and implement the wonderful programming hosted by our chapter. And today we are proud to present to you a great session on storytelling for change. But first we have some quick announcements. This Friday, we invite you to come join our chapter president, Holly Wiseman, for coffee at Ani's Day and Night in Southeast Austin. This is an informal event, very come and go, so please drop by if you can. And then in about 2 weeks, we have our chapter meeting on November 10th. Our chapter meetings are in-person events held over the lunch hour, and they're a great opportunity to connect and learn. The November one will be our last chapter meeting of 2022, as we will take a break in December. So don't miss your chance to join us. We'll hear from Patty DiNucci, who will speak on the art of building conversations and connections with greater purpose, polish, and passion. It's a big title, but it's a big deal. As fundraisers, we know of the importance of having regular and meaningful conversations with donors, volunteers, and team members. Even if you think you know a lot about networking and conversation, you will definitely learn something. This meeting could help you rethink, upgrade, and become more intentional on how you approach and participate in conversations. So you don't have to register for the monthly coffee connection, but you do have to register for the chapter meeting. And all are welcome, whether you are an AFP member or not, and whether you're a fundraiser or not, as we know this topic can apply to anyone. So please feel free to invite others from your organization to join you. You can find more information and register through our website. And then save the date for our biggest event of the year, Philanthropy Day. Next year's event will be on May 5th, 2023. It's a little later than usual and in a new format. It won't be our usual luncheon style. More details to come on that, but one thing will remain, we will have our awards. So awards are open, the nomination for awards are open now and will close on November 4th. Please check our website for the nomination form. And then finally, our chapter is kicking off our Be the Cause campaign to help support our programs and scholarships in 2023. Please consider donating today in support of your local AFP chapter. And if you're interested, here's a QR code if you can take that picture right there. And now to our session. October is known as Ethics Awareness Month for AFP Global, and our Austin chapter wanted to help celebrate this month with a special presentation on ethical storytelling. Our speaker today is Jené Shepard, Director of Marketing and Communications at the Thinkery, and she's one of our board members on the AFP Austin chapter. I was lucky enough to catch Jené's presentation last year during a meeting for the Texas chapter of community-centric fundraisers. And we are so very grateful to Jené for joining us today for presenting on this very important topic. I will hand it off to Jené.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to share my screen and then ask the age-old question if you can see it. So give me 1 second. Y'all can see that? Cool. Thanks for that. So like Melinda said, my name is Jené Shepard. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications at Thinkery and also serve on the AFP Greater Austin Board as the co-VP of Communications. And so I'm real excited to talk about one of my favorite topics today, which is ethical storytelling, and specifically how we can also advance equity through the stories that we're telling. So this is going to be a really informal conversation. Feel free to raise your hand and maybe Melinda can monitor the chat for me because I'm still really bad at doing both 2.5 years into Zoom. So yeah, let's get started. But first I'm going to ask if we can just drop in the chat, or come off mute and say it out loud. When you hear story, what do you think of? What are some of the stories that you encounter or experience in your day-to-day? Grateful patient stories, stories of trauma from clients, some life-changing moments. When I think of stories, I also think of some of the books that I read, some of the videos I see on TikTok. Art is another way that we share stories together. What's one more example? Students learning and growing. Oh, I love that aha moments. So I asked just so that we all kind of have an understanding of the different stories that we're seeing and experiencing on a daily basis, both in our work at mission-oriented organizations, but also just in our day-to-day. Because humans are truly hardwired for story. It's how we think, it's how we experience the world, it's how we communicate with one another. So everything that we do, we tend to turn into a story, whether it is our aha moments when we're volunteering, whether it's something that we see online and then share with our friends. Stories are how we experience the world. And I truly believe that they're a nonprofit's best friend. It's our best tool in our toolkit for raising funds, for sharing about our mission, for getting people involved. Because it grabs our attention, it engages our curiosity. It can also provide new perspectives because you hear about a story from someone whose lifestyle might look different than yours. It can challenge pre-existing assumptions that people might have about different communities. It can trigger empathy and healing in the person sharing their story. One of my favorites is that it creates those memorable moments that are going to be retold, which as a marketer is the best to have someone say, I heard this really awesome story that Thinkery CEO shared. Let me tell you about it. And then at the end, it inspires and incites change. So stories really matter. They are, like I said, the best tool in our toolkit as fundraisers and as nonprofit communicators. But just as they can do so much good in advancing our missions, they can also be done poorly at times and cause harm. And so we often talk about that double bottom line, right? Like we want to respect people, but also raise money. I like to think about it as just a single bottom line. Our single bottom line is that we want to retain the dignity of the clients and communities that we're serving. And that is our priority from beginning to end. So when I think about ethical storytelling, I'm thinking of a couple of different things, and we'll talk more about these later. But the first is, have you gotten consent, and is that consent informed? The second is, whose voice are you prioritizing? Is it the person whose stories and experience is being shared, or is it that of the audience or funder? How might you be perpetuating existing narratives about historically marginalized people and communities? So like, what's the harm you're doing there? And then who's the savior? Is it your organization, the audience, the donor, the funder, the volunteer? And so when I sit down and kind of think through what's the story that I want to tell, these are the things that I start thinking in my head and ask our team to think of as well. So story framing. So story framing is a really fancy word for brainstorming, essentially. It's sitting down and thinking what's the story we're going to tell? How are we going to frame it? And it's what you do before you have the details of who your protagonist is going to be, if it's going to be a video, if it's going to be a blog post. It's just the concept of what the story is going to be. And so when we're often doing this, we think as nonprofits, we think of what we might call the fix the individual stories. And I want us to challenge to move to more fix the system stories. And so those fix the individual stories or individualized stories are those typical success stories that we all tell or hear, especially working in nonprofits. So it is that story of little Johnny who was struggling to graduate high school, and because they engaged with this program, they're now graduated from high school and doing great things. We know that they're successful because people want to know that their dollars are making an impact. We want to celebrate our community when they do well. We also want to just highlight that our work is making a difference and give examples of that. So not saying that they're bad, I'm saying that there might be a different way to do it. And some of the reasons why we need to start to shift away from that is because in practice, oftentimes this narrative focuses on the deficits in communities and frames negative outcomes as inevitables without intervention and uses that as the justification for your services or programs. So sticking with this high school completion nonprofit, we know the stats that, especially here in Central Texas, for Black students, they're less likely to graduate from high school than their peers. That's a stat, it's fact, it's truth. However, if there's no context or the way that we often tell individualized stories, it's showcasing that this student wouldn't have been able to do it without you, which is not true necessarily. And it's not what we want to put out there because it's undermining their ability to make differences and change for themselves. And that framework is often rooted in racism and a savior complex. And it can promote that as well. So part of the transition away from individual stories is to collective stories. So collective stories are highlighting how our community can come together to create systems change. And you'll hear me talk a lot about systems change because that's really at the core, the system that we're all working within and changing that or providing remedies to that is at the core of advancing equity and really highlighting the real reasons and barriers behind a lot of the societal ills that we're working against. So what a collective story looks like in real life is pivoting to focus on telling the story of the systems that your nonprofit or your protagonist / main character is engaged in. So when talking about high school graduation, it could be about a high school guidance counselor that has too many students on their roster to provide services for. It can be the fact that high school graduation is tied into kindergarten readiness. And part of the reason why students are entering kindergarten not ready to succeed is because a lack of affordable early childhood education opportunities. So it's really focusing to tell like the system that we're all in and not putting someone's possible negative outcomes on who they are as a person. Like opportunity isn't universal and neither is access, but intelligence, hard work, perseverance are all character traits that we possess. And so framing it as such is one way that we can tell that story ethically and start to advance equity in that. Another thing to start to do is to shift to talking about the reasons behind disparities in outcomes. And this has been a learning opportunity for me because I have seen this and have struggled with adding in that nuance as well. So when we say that, kids are entering kindergarten ready, like why? What's the reason behind that? Because if we're not saying or sharing a reason behind it, people will fill in the gaps. And sometimes they'll fill in the gaps with the biases that we all possess or make up their own narratives that aren't necessarily true. And then another way to start to shift from that individualized story to collective story is just changing up who's the protagonist in your story. It doesn't always have to be a recipient of your services. A couple of different people that you can feature, and we did this recently at Thinkery, and I think it turned out really well, is an enlightened insider. So someone who has spent time within that system and can talk about its faults and how to change it. So when we're talking about like education, it could be a teacher. If we're talking about a hospital setting or healthcare, it could be a doctor, effective change agent. is someone who was directly impacted by that system and is now working to change it. So it could be a volunteer who's volunteering for that nonprofit because they had a similar experience when they were younger. And then finally, that expert. So who can speak to kind of the bigger picture need and the statistics behind the work that you're doing and how this is something that affects the whole community and not just the people that you're serving. And can also talk about how this is an issue that needs to be solved at a larger, higher level than just that individual micro level of one person, one donation. I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions so far. I feel like I've talked a lot. I'm okay with an awkward silence too. Okay. So moving to talking about how, like after you framed that story, going to, okay, I know the story I want to tell, how do I collect that story in a way that's ethically? So one of the really important things is deep consent. And so that's more than just asking, is it okay if I share your story? It's ensuring that they understand their rights and the potential impact of telling their story. And so I had this experience at a nonprofit I worked at a few years ago where we got consent to share someone's story. They wrote the story and turned it in, and in it revealed about their family's immigration status. And knowing that there's potential impact to sharing those things, went back to that person and said, hey, as a reminder, this is going out to hundreds of people. Are you okay with sharing that? And so just again, just making sure that people truly understand the impact that can happen with them sharing their story in the broader community. And especially when you're working with young people who might struggle to think about that, kind of being their sounding board or asking and checking in with them on their behalf. So some best practices around that is when you're asking people to share their story, making sure that they know how, where, and why their story will be told. So that could be as simple as saying, we're going to use this, we're going to take this story down, we're going to share it on our blog, our social media, and any future marketing or communications efforts. If you're using it to raise money, be really specific about that. You want to partner with people in the creation of their narrative. And so that can be something as closely as working side by side with them to write it. It could be interviewing them and then writing it for them, or it could be having them write it themselves. Changing story details and names as needed to protect someone's privacy. Providing aftercare support if needed. So oftentimes we underestimate how hard it is to get up and share your story, especially if it's not in a written sense, but it's giving a speech, it's talking to a donor one-on-one about your story, it's in a video. That can be really hard, especially when you're talking about traumatic situations or situations that you might not know is traumatic for the person sharing their story. So just having that aftercare support is really important to make sure that your storytellers feel supported. One that I'm incredibly passionate about is compensating people for their time. So that's regardless on if you actually use what they provide you, just them taking time to share their story should result in compensation because you as a nonprofit are making dollars from their story, whether that's because it's being used at a fundraising event or it's being used in a social media campaign that will eventually translate into donations down the line. We should be compensating people for their time. And a huge aspect of that and ingraining these best practices into your day-to-day work is to create a storyteller bill of rights. And so essentially this is just a document that highlights all these best practices. And it's something that when you're asking people to share their story, that you're also sharing, here are the things that we promise to do for you, and here are your rights. You have the right to know how your story is going to be told. You have a right to give final approval. You have the right to say, hey, this is out there now. I no longer want it out there. Let's take it down. And just being on the same page and going through that when you're asking people to share their stories will really just help eliminate the possibility of doing any harm when we're telling stories, especially when we're working with groups that might have trauma associated on their story. Another incredible part about ethical storytelling is the language we use. Words mean things, words have power. And so we need to make sure that the words that we're using are inclusive and represent the community appropriately. So some best practices around that is use people first language, but prioritize self-identification or identity first language. So people first language is, for example, you would say a person with diabetes rather than calling someone a diabetic. However, if someone refers to themselves as a diabetic, that is okay, and that is how they identify, and it's how you should use that in your story. So especially when you are interviewing people or having them write it themselves, ask how they want to be identified. And also, if their identities aren't related to the story you're telling, there is no purpose to sharing that. If you're talking about, I always go back to education because I work in education, but if you're talking about a student learning how to read, if that student being from a single parent household isn't integral to the story, why are we sharing it unless it's to pull on heartstrings? Which in my opinion isn't ethical. It's not the most ethical thing to do. So when you're thinking about what language to use, doing your research and seeing what progressive organizations or activist groups in your space are using. Avoid deficit language, which we'll talk a little bit more in a second. Keep writing at an 8th grade reading level. So the average American reads on an 8th grade or lower reading level. So that's like To Kill a Mockingbird. And so even if you're like, oh, I'm writing for donors, and a lot of them have a college education or higher, we still don't want to read a thesis when we're on your social media page, right? So keep it at an 8th grade reading level. It makes it easier for people to understand and digest and engage with that content. And so there is an online platform called the Hemingway Editor, where you can copy and paste your content in there, and it spits out what the reading level is. And so you can kind of play with your sentence. A lot of the times it's sentence structure. So you can play with your sentence structure to shorten the sentences a little bit, use less punctuation, to bring it down to that reading level. And then the last part, again, how do you create this work in a way that it doesn't leave when you leave and that everyone's on the same page? And so a huge part of that is creating an inclusive language guide. So something that says, these are the words that our organization uses, and these are the words that we don't use. And it's something that you evaluate as things change in our community. And so I'm going to attempt to show a TikTok video because I love TikTok and I think it's a great learning tool, among other things. And so there's this really awesome guy. So I can stop sharing. Who talks about nonprofit fundraising work on his TikTok. And I found out about him through Full Humanity Consulting. And there is this really awesome video where he talks about deficit language that I wanted to share. Can everyone see that? Yeah.
Yes, and I want to push you on this. We should stop referring to kids as at-risk, underprivileged, under-resourced, or any label that saddles them with the burden that society has placed on them. No kid has ever asked me to call them at-risk or under-resourced, and I would never stand next to Jamil and his mom and call them those terms. So I'm not going to talk about people in a way that I wouldn't speak to them. Those terms put attention on the kid and turn the attention away from the systems that need to be changed. Because how does a kid become under-resourced? They go to a divested school in a divested community with limited economic opportunity. They didn't earn any of that. When they show up to my program, they're being determined, they're being ambitious. And describing them by the burdens that they haven't earned is going to do two things. First, it's going to lower the bar for what's acceptable, because a program providing opportunities for determined and ambitious youth is going to be judged differently from a program providing opportunities to under-resourced youth. All you've changed is the label, but the expectations have shifted in life-changing ways. Those negative terms are also going to attract more saviors, people who need to feel a sense of pity and superiority for others before they provide a service that's good for all of society. And if a critical mass of your funders are saviors, they're going to control the mission. And that's step one to having an organization that benefits from poverty. Let's get back to work. Yes, and I want to push you on.
And so I loved how he talked about their term at risk or under-resourced or underserved. Those are terms that we typically use to talk about the communities that we're serving. At risk is especially a deficit-based thing, because what are they at risk for? And B, you would never go to someone's face and say, you're an at-risk youth. And so those are just things to avoid when you're writing, and be really clear about the populations that you're serving. He works for a youth serving organization in Chicago. And so he talks about, he works with ambitious young leaders. So just being mindful about the words that we use to talk about the people we're serving and the stories that we tell, because again, words mean things, they have power, and they can confirm biases that people have. And the communities that you're serving hear them. And if we want people to feel valued and to feel like a sense of belonging, the words that we use are really important in that. And then the visuals that we use are also really important. So if you're spending a lot of time creating an ethical story that advances equity, you're using the right words. We want to make sure that the visuals we have are also appropriate. So you want to make sure that the photos represent the diversity of your community. And so that goes beyond race or ethnicity, but gender identity, gender expression, ability levels. Being mindful that the photos are not perpetuating negative stereotypes. So for example, are all your photos of volunteers or donors able-bodied, cis white men, and all of the students or families or community members that you're serving not? So just like, what are the ways that we are highlighting power dynamics in the photos that we use? And then again, getting consent to take and share photos. That doesn't even necessarily have to mean getting a photo waiver, just asking people that it's okay to share their photos. Because they might have signed a waiver 3 days ago, but today they don't like how their hair looks and they don't want that photo on the internet. At least that's me sometimes. So just asking if it's okay. And some key takeaways on all of this work, I think, are obtaining that deep consent when you're collecting stories. So how are you letting people know what you're going to use with the stories that they tell, how it's going to be shared, that they can revoke their permission, that they can ask to be compensated for it, that you start to make that move from those individualized success stories to collective stories, that are highlighting and talking about the systems that we're all living under and working within, that are using different storytellers beyond just necessarily clients. And thinking through, how do you operationalize all of this work so that it's ingrained in your department's DNA? This shouldn't be something that lives with one person. It should be something that everyone, whether you're working directly one-on-one with donors as a major gift officer, whether you're the communications coordinator, you're the CDO, you're the ED or CEO, that this is something that you all are agreed on and that you're all working to integrate and incorporate into your daily work. So I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions or comments.
Jené, there was some questions quite a bit ago when you were talking about the storyteller's Bill of Rights. Heather asked, is there a storyteller Bill of Rights that is already created, or is this something we can create in our own? And then
Yes.
the question of, do you have a template you prefer to use?
Yeah, great questions. So there is a storyteller Bill of Rights template. I will drop it in the chat. And so what I've done is I have, depending on the organization that I work with, taken this and adjusted it for the org that I work for, because everything is slightly different depending on what you're able to provide or not provide. And so, yeah, I will drop that in the chat.
I have a question. Can you hear me okay, Jené?
I can, Kara.
Hi. This might be in your resources there, but do you have any examples you really like of stories that talk about systems in a really like approachable and concise way?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, I do. The hard thing is the conciseness. So I think what we often think about when it comes to stories are that they're one and done, that we share one story in its fullness on one platform and that's it. I'm a big believer in this concept of the rule of fives, meaning whatever content you create, you use at least 5 times, because why are we constantly creating new content? So if you're telling a story about a family and you want to talk deeper about the systems that they're engaged in, that's really hard to do in one post on social media. But it is something that you can do in multiple posts on social media where you're parsing out their story. You can share a clip or a quote from their story that links back to a blog post that has it out longer. You can use video content to talk about it, and it's more engaging, and you can be slightly more rambling in a video than you can in writing. So that's a non-answer answer, but yes, I have examples that I will share. And it's sometimes hard to be concise because this is a really complicated problem. It's not a concise problem. And so there are some tips and tricks that you can use to tell that story in bite-sized pieces and really take your readers on a journey with you. I think if you're also incorporating this into the stories that you're telling consistently, you won't have to always name it at a certain point because you've trained your audience to know when we are fighting poverty, we're also fighting against systemic racism. Great question, Kara. What else? What are some of the stories that y'all are telling? Jeff said, there are so many ways to convey a story, from videos to blogs to social media and emails. Have you come across any data in regards to marketing where stories are both accessed, viewed when trying to share with a larger audience? Yes, so I think in my experience and the work, some of the research that I've done, it's really going to be dependent on your audience. And so doing some data collection and testing on your own. So for example, at my old organization, our emails probably had a 30% open rate. So email, which was good by industry standard, but I knew that sending something in an email and expecting people to read it probably wasn't the best way to get them to engage with our stories. We always saw bigger traction when posting on social media. At my current organization, their open rates are 70 to 80%, which is ridiculously high. And so I know that pushing things out through pushing information out via email is really effective for that audience. Whereas for our social media, the stuff that we get the most engagement about, I'm referring to Thinkery, the stuff that we get the most engagement about is our upcoming events happening at the museum, because that's what people are going there looking for. So I think part of it is seeing what works best for your audiences and doing some of that data digging and analytics. And I think, again, using the rule of 5, you have that one story and you're putting it across all of your different platforms in different ways. Because you're always going to reach someone different. There's different ways to tell that story on different platforms. And I think you're also, in this day and age, with all of the logarithms that make it hard to get your stuff seen on things like Facebook or Instagram, just the more you put out there, the more engaging stuff you put out there, the more video stuff you get out there, the better. So the rule of 5 is that you want to use whatever content you create at least 5 times. So if it's a blog, you want to share that blog at least 5 times on different platforms, through different email newsletters, on social media. Is it something that you're sharing in your Teams or Slack with folks that are in your organization, so that you're not necessarily creating content for different platforms, to make it a little bit easier on your team, and to reach different audiences with the same story.
Hi, Jené.
Hi, Holly.
I love the idea of the Storyteller Bill of Rights. It's something in my organization that we've, as you know, that we've incorporated. I'm curious if you have any recommendations, because there's like the internal adoption of that and what that looks like, but then also thinking about, many of us work with fundraising volunteers, and especially through events, thinking about how stories are told. And so I'm curious if you have any recommendations for kind of rolling a tool like that out, and to adopt, with our board, with our fundraising committees as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I like to think of the Story Bill of Rights as kind of the guiding principles for all the work that we do. And so just like there's gift acceptance policies, just like there is policies around how we ask for donations, I think rolling this out and sharing it with people at the beginning, when you're working with the board, you're working with your fundraising committees, and you're saying, hey, we can't tell stories this way because of this. And now we have this document that lays that out, and sharing why, I think, is the first step to retraining people to think through how effective communications can be when it comes to nonprofit storytelling. I think we so often have seen it done one way, and it's hard to change because it's quote unquote high risk, right? Like, you don't want to not raise dollars. But when you go from a point of, this is what our organization's adopting, and it's something we're doing because of our commitment to our bottom line of not doing harm to the communities we serve, and just incorporating that into like the lexicon of your committee and of your fundraising volunteers, I think goes a long way in starting.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, so Jeff asked, are there any additional learning materials, books, podcasts, websites, etc.? Great question. So some of my favorite sites, there is the community-centric fundraising website. They have a lot of great articles around storytelling. There is Nonprofit AF, which is Fu Lee's blog, and he's one of the big proponents of community-centric fundraising, and he talks a lot about storytelling. There is the Ethical Rainmaker podcast, which talks about ethical fundraising. And I believe, so in the follow-up, we'll send the slides, and I'll send some resources. So I'm not just naming them off, but there's some good things out there, some great work that people are doing. And I'll make sure that those things are linked there for you. Any other questions? I guess I have a question for y'all. How are you incorporating some of these like ethical storytelling principles into your day-to-day work? Are you, or is this the first time that like you're being exposed to these ideas? Don't leave me hanging. I'm going to start calling on people. Holly.
I knew you would.
I knew, because I know you have an answer. At your organization, how are y'all talking about ethical storytelling?
Yeah, so I think multiple ways. One, we have, and it's been a journey, and it's certainly not something that we've perfected. It's in kind of an ongoing practice for sure, but have worked really hard around the deficit language, and in our storytelling, really emphasizing all of the amazing strengths that the students and the communities we serve, highlighting what, all of that they bring to the table, and trying to talk about the systems that they're encountering that are barriers versus making it personal. We have adopted a storytelling Bill of Rights and storytellers principles of trust, and we have it posted on our website. And anytime we ask a student to share their story, and it could be something as small as a quote, or to speak in an event, or what, large and small, when we ask, we provide that on the front side, so they know going into it what the expectations are, what their rights are, how we're going to show up. We have also started providing compensation for any of our clients in that who share their story. And again, it's depending on if they're taking a short amount of time to share a quote or something about their experience in writing, fill out a survey that we could incorporate, versus, that compensation might look different for that, versus they're going to be the kind of keynote speaker at our fundraising event. And so we take that into consideration on the compensation side. And we've also realized that even our program team, it's not just our development and communications team that are soliciting stories or experiences from our students. So we make sure that our program team has that tool as well, and are incorporating that when they engage with folks. I really love your recommendation for including it in onboarding for board and committees. That's something I definitely want to adopt. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. The deficit language is like, that's the one that I feel like is one of the ones that takes the most practice, because it's been so ingrained in our, you know, in our work over the years, in our grant language or whatever, the underserved, the at-risk, all of that stuff. Like, that's really been a practice to change that.
I agree. I love what you said, Holly, about arming the programs team with this information and resources and tools as well. I think making this work part of the culture of philanthropy that you are creating at your organization is key. I'm making sure that everyone is on the same page with it. Crystal asked, is anyone else in the group compensating those who share their stories? So I know Holly is doing it at her org. I've done it at Thinkery, which I'm currently at, and at my past organization. We did gift cards for folks. And similar to what Holly was saying, it looks different depending on the amount of time that they're giving to us. And also, to be quite honest, they're like who they are. Like, a board member probably doesn't need a $25 Target gift card, but they should know that they have the right to ask for one as part of the Storyteller Bill of Rights. Yeah, I love that experiences that they've identified as valuable. I think also inviting, if you're creating a story for an event, invite them to your event. You know, I think that like it's a process to get there, and we all have tight budgets. And so it was something that this year I worked into our budget as a Marcom team.
Another thing that we've started doing is being more like, rather than, you know, if we're looking for a speaker for an event or something like that, I think previously we would have gone to our program team and said, hey, like, do you know someone who could do this? And now we're being a lot more inclusive about putting it out to all of our students and letting those opt in. Some are naturally like much more open and really want to share their experience. And so we lean on that, lean into that, and work with those who are really eager and excited to do that.
Yeah, some people really want to share their story, and some people really don't. And so I think it's respecting that spectrum too, and finding mediums for them to share their story that feel comfortable for them. So some people might feel more comfortable with giving a quote, and some people might feel very comfortable getting in front of camera or standing up at an event and speaking from their heart. And so I think just like when we're building relationships with donors, one of my favorite things about storytelling is the relationship that you get to build with the person whose story you're sharing, and giving them a platform to share that story, especially if it is a larger project like a keynote or a video. It's just a really beautiful relationship that you get to build. So I'm gonna time for one more question or comment. Well, thank you all so much. And again, in the follow-ups, we'll share the slides as well as some resources, and I'll share my contact information in case there are any additional questions.
Thanks, Jené. One thing I do want to add for you guys who are CFRE folks is in the post-event email, I will send the form that has the CFRE credit on it so that if you need to use that to fill that out, you'll have it. And we'll make sure to include a copy of the recording of this session as well as all of the links that Jené just referred to. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jené.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Bye.